May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be now and always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Do you remember the song, Any Dream Will Do? Andrew Lloyd Webber wrote a stage production entitled Joseph's Technicolor Dreamcoat. Initially, I hadn't seen the production, so I labelled it as a modern, noisy day production and one I needed to stay away from. But, having seen it, I enjoyed it. It is based on our first reading this morning from Genesis in chapter 37. And the small picture on page 4 of the pew sheet is not just a decoration. The story is of Joseph and his 11 brothers and their father, Isaac. Like you heard the story in Sunday school many times. But do you believe that our lives are already mapped out for us? I believe that our lives were planned before we were born. All you need is to have faith in Jesus and to believe in him. This doesn't mean that your life will be smooth and without any hiccups. Remember to look on the bright side of the hiccups, and you will find that God is working his purpose out. As Paul said in his letter to the Romans, for it is by faith that we are put right with God. It is by our own confession that we are saved. And remember that everyone who calls out to the Lord for help will be saved. First, Joseph. Was he a Christian? Joseph lived 4,000 years ago and was about 110 years old when he died. As you know, Joseph was his father's favourite son, and his father showed this by giving him a coat of many colours. Although in reality, it was probably more of an ornate coat with a lot of embroidery. Joseph was a dreamer, although more correctly, he was an interpreter of dreams. It was his interpretation of the dreams that caused his brothers to hate him. It all started when Joseph was about 17. Two of his brothers had dreams. Joseph interpreted these as his brothers bowing down to him. The brothers were determined that would never happen. Thus the hate or the jealousy started. The fact Joseph had a new coat from his father turned them even more against him. When the opportunity was ripe, they seized him and sold him to some traders. Remember that in all of this, Joseph did nothing except to display his attribute to interpret dreams. But if these things had not happened, the rest of the story would have been different. God was working his purpose out. Once in Egypt, Joseph was sold to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, and after a while was given the full control of Potiphar's properties. All was going well until Joseph resisted the approaches from Potiphar's wife, and she took the opportunity and screamed, "Rape!" Joseph, being Hebrew, was thrown into prison. Again, Joseph was punished because of the actions of others. God was still working his purpose out. We're told that God remained with Joseph. In prison, Joseph met up with a cupbearer and a baker who were also in prison. Both had dreams which Joseph interpreted. He told the cupbearer that within 3 days he would be restored to Pharaoh's household. And this happened. He told the baker and gave the baker 3 days before Pharaoh hanged him. Again, this happened. A couple of years later, Pharaoh had a dream, as no one else could. Joseph interpreted the dream of 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of his house for these periods. If God had not guided Potiphar's wife, the cupbearer and the baker, Joseph would never have been there to be called on by Pharaoh. And of course, we come back to the dreams Joseph interpreted many years before. Joseph's brothers did bow down to him. God is still working his purpose out in our reading from St. Matthew. Then Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side of the lake, while he sent the people away. After sending the people away, he went up a hill by himself to pray. When evening came, Jesus was there alone, and at this time the boat was far out in the lake, being tossed by the waves, because the wind was blowing against it. Between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came to the disciples, walking on the water. The disciples were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they screamed with fear. Then Peter spoke up. "Lord, if it is really you, order me to come out onto the water to you." So Peter got out of the boat and started walking on the water towards Jesus. But when he noticed a strong wind, he was afraid, and he started to sink down into the water. "Save me, Lord," he cried. At once, Jesus reached out and grabbed hold of him. "What little faith you have! Why did you doubt?" They both got into the boat, and the wind died down. Then the disciples in the boat worshipped Jesus. "Truly, you are the Son of God," they exclaimed. I now come back to look at myself. God started this sermon this morning over 60 years ago, possibly before that. I was born in England and grew up with a family that went to church. In the early 1950s, whilst I was an angelic choir boy, a Tasmanian by the name of Oliver Hayward came to our church in England as an assistant curate. He later became Bishop Oliver Hayward, and he took me for confirmation classes. Oliver returned to Tasmania, and this enthused my parents to come to Tasmania, bring myself and my brother with them. This was a big upheaval to my life. I was 17 years old, the same age as Joseph when he was sold to Egypt. At the time, I realised that I was coming to a wonderful country where kangaroos jumped up and down the main street and even in the cities. Yeah. My views did change once I got here. I didn't realise it, but God had plans for me that far back. I completed school and had two choices. I could become an apprentice chemist, or I could study music. I chose to study music in Melbourne. Suddenly, for the first time in my life, I was in a big city, the city of Melbourne, all by myself and staying at the YMCA. I lived there for 2 years. In that time, a small Christian group met at the YMCA, and we used to visit St Paul's Cathedral for the early Sunday morning service. And of course, this included breakfast afterwards. Then came the opening to become the organist at St James in East St Kilda, which had an active youth group with activities. It was there that I met and married Jennifer. I didn't realise it at the time, but God was with me. I did not complete the music course. After 3 years, I still failed first year history of music. Jennifer and I returned to Tasmania, and I joined the police force. I was posted to several country towns, but I was a strange copper. I carried out my tasks and I went to church. And I played the organ. Something that coppers didn't do. Then 4 years before I retired, I moved into a position which no one else wanted, and for which I was told that I was too senior. I moved into the coroner's office. It was probably one of the most satisfying positions I had had in the police force. I was in a position where I could put into effect my Christian beliefs and where I was able to communicate with members of the community at some of the lowest points in their lives. I was able to help them. It was a task that I could not have accomplished without God's help. God was definitely with me. God has definitely had an influence on my life. Otherwise, I would still be working back in England. God is working his purpose out. Lastly, I come to a person who lived 2,000 years ago. Peter, the Apostle St. Peter. He'd been a fisherman all his life. Then suddenly, Jesus turned his life upside down with the words, "Follow me." Without answering this call, Peter would still have been a fisherman and not a fisher of men. In today's Gospel, we hear of one of the exploits of this man of God. Jesus came out to his disciples walking on the water. The disciples were afraid and did not believe it. But Peter displayed a lot of bravado when he said, "Lord, tell me to come to you." Peter had the faith and actually walked on the water until he looked down. And it was then he began to sink, and Jesus did save him. If we keep our eyes on Jesus, I am certain that he will save us and look after us. The Apostle Paul says, "For it is by our faith that we are put right with God. It is by our confession that we are saved." He also says, "Everyone who calls out to God for help will be saved." Amen.